We all have those players we hate, whether they used to play for our team or currently are. In this series, I decided to cover each player that is most hated from every team. Now, let's start the count for the most hated players in all of the NHL. Anaheim Ducks. Corey Perry. He's got one of the worst reputations in the entire league for dirty stuff that he does beyond the watchful eye of the men with the orange armbands. And that's just the stuff he gets away with. For everything else, he's got a rap sheet with a country mile long, full of illegal hits and violent stick work. He also over-retaliates to perfectly legal contact that, like an entitled little brat who's never been told no. Ducks fans have no problem overlooking all that, though because he's one of their best playmakers on the team, but Perry's definitely not touching many hearts outside of Southern California. Arizona Coyotes. Steve Downey. Steve Unnecessary Roughness Downey was a dirty, spiteful hockey player who stampeded through the NHL for parts of 9 seasons, creating enemies all along the way, and leaving a lot of haters in his wake. An equal opportunity aggressor, Downey didn't limit his malicious behavior to opposing teams and players. When he wasn't throwing blindsided hits and sucker punches, he was fighting his own teammates and abusing officials. He only played in 26 games for the Arizona Coyotes towards the very end of his professional career, but his belligerent 2016 Christmas time Twitter tirade against the entire Coyotes organization and Don Cherry, of all people, condemning the attitude of violence in the NHL well after his retirement is enough to make him Arizona's most hated player ever. Boston Bruins. Brad Marchand. Do I even need to go into why the rat made it here to begin with? If you don't know, this guy slew-foots anyone and everyone that gets near him. He's also the league's biggest pest. If there's one thing that every NHL fan can agree on, outside of, Bruins fans, of course, is on how much they actually hate this guy. Buffalo Sabres. Rob Ray. It wasn't a true Sabres game until Rob Ray dropped the gloves on somebody. Ray was an imposing enforcer and all-around tough guy for the Buffalo Sabres for 13 seasons in the 1990s and early 2000s. He took pleasure in striking up and maintaining bitter rivalry with some of the most prolific fighters in the league, and even learned to skirt the rules to win a lot of fights by shedding his jersey and shoulder pads. According to Jeremy Roenick, he also took trash talking past the line of acceptability. Currently, Ray is 6th in the entire league with 3,207 penalty minutes. So that ought to tell you a little bit about why Ray is on this list. Calgary Flames. Theo Flurry. For a guy who stood all of 5'6", Theo Flurry sure packed a lot of punch. He was angry, a man on a constant tirade with a temper as short as, he was. While it's pretty understandable now, with recent revelations of some of his deepest, darkest secrets detailed in his recently released memoir, it doesn't take away from the fact that he was the target of a lot of hate from a lot of people during his time in the league. Fast and aggressive, Flurry made up for his lack of size by never backing down from a fight, and even making a point to go out looking for them. Carolina Hurricanes. Ulf Samuelsson. Public enemy number 1. That's who Samuelsson was to pretty much everyone during his 16 years in the NHL, between 1984 and 2000. Seriously, he was a nightmare on skates. Samuelsson had a total disregard for his opponent's safety and apparently had never heard of the concept of compassion. He had a habitually bad habit of targeting players' knees when he threw a check, raising his elbows faceward when doing a battle in the corners, and using a stick more often as a weapon than it actually was meant for. Lots of players were outspoken about their disdain for Samuelsson back then, but never seemed to care. With a name like Ulf, I can understand why he might be a little bitter. Chicago Blackhawks. Patrick Kane. Patrick Kane is one of the best forwards in the NHL. He seems to know this and believes he can get away with anything. In 2009, Patrick Kane was riding in a taxi in Buffalo, New York. Kane owed the cab driver $12.50 for his tax fare. After the driver told Kane he didn't have change for the $15 he had handed him, Kane punched the driver in the face, grabbed his throat, and broke the driver's glasses. Kane then fled the scene without paying. Kane was charged with robbery, criminal mischief, and theft of services. And if that's not enough, need I mention his other little disdain in court? Probably not. I think this is enough. Anyways, Kane has lost a lot of respect from NHL fans across the league because of this cab driver incident. Colorado Avalanche. Claude Lemieux. I feel like this one was pretty much a no-brainer. Perhaps the most universally hated player in league history, Claude Lemieux was a super villain on skates. His on-ice behavior was downright despicable, and his ability to bury himself under the skin of his opponents is what will haunt many in the league until their dying days. His ugly check from behind Chris Draper in 1996 birthed the historically nasty rivalry between the Colorado Avalanche and Detroit Redwings that endured for a good decade, and he once bit Calgary forward Jim Peplinski's finger in a scrum. What opponents probably hated most about Lemieux, though, was the fact that not only was he a dirty player, but he was also highly skilled and scored a lot of big goals. Double negative for anyone not wearing the same uniform that he was. Columbus Blue Jackets. Jeff Carter. In this rare instance, the player drew the bulk of hate from his own teammates and fans. Traded to Columbus during the 2011 offseason, Jeff Carter made it clear that he never wanted to be in Ohio in the first place. What can only be described as a petulant protest, Carter put a bitter taste in the mouths of Columbus fans with his refusal to engage with both media and his teammates, and his visual lack of effort every time he jumped over the boards for another shift was enough for everyone. He basically forced Blue Jackets management to trade him in late 2012 after less than a season with the team, and landed in Los Angeles, where he promptly rediscovered his talents and won a Stanley Cup with them. Dallas Stars. Steve Ott. Steve Ott was one of the most polarizing players that the Dallas Stars organization ever saw, and easily the most hated man to play in the heart of Texas. Ott talked a big game and did a good job of getting opposing players off theirs. He even learned to swear in several foreign languages in order to trash talk to players hailing from other countries. But Ott had a reputation for turtling and shrinking away like a coward when someone finally confronted him. He wasn't above cheap shots though, and served well over 1,500 penalty minutes and was sentenced to several multi-game suspensions over his 15-year career. But more than anything, he mastered the art of being a gigantic pest, and for that, he was hated. Detroit Red Wings. Bob Probert. Bob Probert almost single-handedly defined the culture of violence in the NHL's rough and tumble 1980s and early 1990s. He was a hard-nosed player and a tough guy enforcer who crossed the line on both on and off the ice with his demeanor and habitual substance abuse. His fierce loyalty and willingness to mix it up at the drop of a hat ignited more than a handful of career-spanning rivalries with his most hated detractors. He thrice exceeded 300 penalty minutes, and in 1990-1991, he averaged over 5 penalty minutes per game. But as much as his opponents hated him, his teammates loved him even more. He dedicated blood, sweat, and tears to earn his reputation, and these days most guys who played against him appreciated his passion for the game. Florida Panthers. Shawn Thornton. Shawn Thornton is one of those guys that you just can't stand, but you're not exactly sure why. He's not particularly good, and really not that bad of a dude, but something about him just makes your skin crawl. Once a bruiser dishing out round after round of fisticuffs for the Boston Bruins, Thornton had to reinvent his game in a post-enforcer world, and then skated as a bottom six forward for the Florida Panthers after he was traded. He's not innocent of hating-induced conduct by any means, though. One look at a replay of his glove-handed assault on an innocent Brooks Orpik in 2013, is probably what tainted his reputation. Edmonton Oilers. Esa Tikkanen. If his ugly mug and receding hairline doesn't make you clench your jaw in boundless scorn, Esa Tikkanen's insistence on being an annoying little nap surely would do it. Tasked with protecting Wayne Gretzky in the 1980s, Tikkanen took his role way too seriously. Between his incoherent half-English, half-Finnish tiki talk, dialect, and tomahawking slashes, Tikkanen was one of the biggest, most hated players ever. The thing that caused just as much, if not more hate for Tikkanen though, was when he was with the Washington Capitals and missed a wide-open goal in Game 2 of the 1998 Stanley Cup Finals against the Detroit Red Wings. The goal would have put the game out of reach for the Wings and allowed the Caps to tie the series at 1. But the Wings would go on to tie the game and eventually win it in overtime. A momentum-swinging sequence that changed the course of the series, as the Wings would go on to sweep the finals 4-0. LA Kings. Marty Mcsorley. You knew this was coming. You could be the most beloved son in all the land before doing what Marty Mcsorley did, and still be damned to the pits of hockey hell for doing the wicked act he pulled. People already harbored a lot of hate for Mcsorley for his constant goon-like ways, but then he had to go and commit an actual crime by viciously clubbing Vancouver tough guy Donald Brashear over the head with his stick near the end of a game in 2000, when he was with the Bruins. He ended up being convicted of assault in a British Columbia court after the incident and was suspended by the NHL for an entire calendar year. He would never make it back into the league, which made the final acts of his NHL career one of violence, thus cementing his place in hockey infamy forever. Minnesota Wild. Matt Cooke. I have a sneaking suspicion that most fans, and even players, would hesitate a few seconds before throwing a life ring to a drowning Matt Cooke. Best known for his 5 tumultuous years in Pittsburgh with the Penguins, Matt Cooke spent his final 2 NHL seasons in Minnesota, immediately earning the title for the most hated player in Wild history. For nearly his entire career, Cooke took dirty to a whole different level. He disobeyed both written and unwritten rules of the game with reckless behavior, causing many to demand his permanent ouster time and time again. He was constantly suspended for his inexcusable cheap shots and repeated deliberate attempts to injure opposing players, and was generally just a total dirtbag through and through. Montreal Canadiens. Subin. He has been called a villain by fan bases and opponents across the NHL, and one former pro even called him a piece of garbage in an ESPN piece. And while Subin brings a lot of personality to the ice with him, it wasn't very appreciated by critics in Montreal. He's been seen as an overly cocky and just downright dirty player. And let's not forget that whole Jordan Staal incident back in Pittsburgh. That whole deal still had Pens fans booing him last season every time he touched the puck.